Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Brantley Smith, graduate of IHOP U. Brantley, it's good to have you on here, and to the audience who can't see it, this is the second time in a row I've had Brantley on because I accidentally forget to hit record right before this, so embarrassing for me, but the second time is always better than the first, so I'm glad you're doing...
Making me dig up all my trauma again.
Oh, man. I'm glad we're going through this. Glad we're going through this a second time, but so it'd be good if everybody could get to know you a little bit more. So maybe if you could tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So my name's Brantley, and I live out in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Got a wife and two kids, 33 years old now. I have grown up in environments, I guess that most people here would recognize as NAR type environments. My extended family, grew up to my great-granddad, were Holiness Pentecostal people, so I never saw my grandmother in anything but a dress and like no makeup or earrings or anything like that until the Brownsville revival in the 90s. Then that's whenever she found her freedom, she said. And so I had a very legalistic kind of upbringing, and then started leading worship in church when I was 14 years old. So been doing that and still doing that, working at a church here in Virginia Beach, doing some worship stuff, and ended up going to the house of prayer when I was 17 years old and still trying to figure out how to live life after all that. So,
well, it's so good to have you on here to talk about IHOP, and we have a lot of history in common based on the things that we discussed previously. And, you know, even though you were not born and raised in IHOP and came into that specific cult later, I'm certain that prior to this, you shared some of the themes that I can relate to in my time in the Branham cult and the Branham religion. We were talking about how some of the eschatology, for example, was very similar to what Branham had, and these themes are very common among all of the religions. And I've got up on my monitor right now a photograph that somebody sent me of a revival that was held with William Branham and Nathaniel Urshan, which will blow people's minds, right? Because a lot of this history has been covered up. But as you go back and you start to untangle all of these roots that we're tracing, not directly, not ending with Branham, but through Branham into other movements, he was like the central hub. You start to realize that themes of theology just kind of flowed through all of these groups.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I'm so grateful for all your podcasts and stuff that you're doing, John, because I was unaware of all the different crossover points. Even before we get to the big one of Paul Kane and IHOP, even Amy Semple McPherson had no idea that she was involved with these people. She was in a total different world. Had conversations with people about John G. Lake and some of these other guys, the God's generals. I think your audience is familiar with that term. That were idolized and stuff, and just had no idea that there was so much cross-pollination between these movements. And I joked with you, off air, that you've kind of brought out my conspiracy theorist that the cult put in me to begin with. You kind of brought that back out. I had to kill that. Now it's showing its head again. And I'm like, what are these guys up to? But the Paul Kane connection for me was huge because I knew nothing about Paul Kane's life prior to him being a Kansas City prophet. Didn't know he had a life prior to that, to be honest. I was sharing with you earlier that I got to IHOP. I was there from 2008 to 2012. And Paul Kane was there, physically present on IHOP property the entire pretty much the entire time that I was there, and I had no clue. He had his public fall from grace, I guess his final one in 2006-ish, somewhere in that ballpark, and they had him holed up there on Shiloh property, their little retreat property. He had a little house out there, and they did their best to keep him there to make sure he wasn't doing anything too crazy, but I don't think they were too successful at that. But we always heard stories about IHOP's drinking policy. So IHOP used to, which me growing up, Holiness Pentecostal, alcohol was always a no-no. Like, it wasn't, the only time it was accepted and still accepted in my granddad's house is cough syrup. That's what we call it, which is just moonshine and some honey and some other stuff. But there's an exception for that, a little wine for the stomach, you know. But I get to IHOP, there's no drinking policy. And I found out, just like in this past year, is talking with friends and hearing behind the scenes stories and stuff, the big reason there was an alcohol ban was because Paul Kane was doing crazy stuff as an alcoholic there on the missions base and getting other people to drink. And it just got out of hand. And so it's crazy just how connected these worlds are whenever it comes to men of power and politics and all that stuff too. It's insane.
Yeah, it's shocking. You know, I grew up in a different cult, but you know, it was, you might consider it the grandfather to the IHOP in certain ways. And the alcohol thing, I'll never forget. After I had left this cult, I think I've talked about this before, but I had severe depression, especially after leaving. You and I talked about this a bit too. I was nearly crippled with it, the depression from leaving. And there was a buildup of depression right before leaving. And I'll never forget, I was working with a client down in Atlanta, and a lady, we were at this fancy, I think it was a Regency Hyatt, and they had nothing but top shelf liquor. And when the waitress or waiter came around to your table, it wasn't water that they poured in. They poured very, very expensive wine. And I'm like, I'm thirsty. What do I drink? I can't drink this stuff. And but yet at the same time, I no longer believed it was wrong. I had studied, you know, enough to know that it's not the way we were taught. And long story short, I tried just a sip off of the wine after a lot of peer pressure, and my depression felt like needles going in and out of my head at all times. And that night, after it wasn't much more than a tablespoon or two, but the pressure left and the anxiety, it was just enough to cut a little bit of the anxiety. And so I came back home and I started drinking just a glass, and it tasted to me like cat pee smelled. It was so nasty. But I would take like Sprite and I would mix it in there and I would drink. Long story short, after about 3 months, I was actually able to come off of depression meds because it was cutting the anxiety and, you know, that and healing from leaving a cult. So all things together, like the Bible said, take a little wine for your stomach. Well, for me, it was take a little wine for your head, and it worked.
Yeah. That my crazy era, you know, people have their wild oats eras. I've been pretty straight laced being in the environment I have my whole life. But my first time smoking and my first time drinking alcohol was all at IHOP, and so I'm thankful for those friends that helped me broaden my boundaries there a little bit. I remember that the first time I ever tried alcohol was at a small group. Then we did communion and they used real wine. And I remember being so, but it was a wine, so it was really sweet. So we took it and then we were asking for more afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, in the Branham churches, they preached against wine. Well, drinking wine was sinful in the Branham churches. But for communion, they gave you real wine. So it's like this, what am I doing? Am I sinning or am I not? So
they're just the primary dealer.
Yeah. But yeah, you talk about Paul Kane, and it's just so shocking to me, the fact that whenever I look at these groups, and I had no idea how close they were, but I was watching IHOP from a distance before the big explosions that happened a few years ago. And I'm looking at the similarity and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, that looks really like the cult we escaped, but they don't believe the same thing. That's what I thought. And it wasn't until I believe it was one of the articles on Todd Bentley. They were going into the Manifested Sons of God and the Joel's Army. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is Branhamism 101. Where did they get it? And I found Paul Kane's name, and, you know, all the pieces started tumbling together. And from what I understand, Paul Kane, not just with IHOP, but several of the other big names, and I won't mention them, but he helped to establish a lot of the theology that came across the NAR networks. And, you know, again, it's Branhamism 101 that he's teaching them.
Yeah, Paul Kane, that's how I ended up finding IHOP, is at our church. They were cleaning out a closet that was full of old tapes. We had a staff member that had left, and it was stuff that he had stashed in there. And he was a real big prayer guy, doing prayer meetings at our church and stuff. And I found this tape on this table that was set up of free stuff for people to take. It was a tape of Paul Kane and Mike Bickle. And I must have known something about Mike at that point. Maybe I had come across Passion for Jesus and stuff at that point. I can't remember exactly how the timeline played out, but I'd read Mike's book and encountered some of the music. And it's somewhere along the lines, they were pioneers in that they had their live stream going before, even like Twitch and some of the stuff that we have now that makes streaming so accessible. You could pay, I think it was like $10-$20 a month, and I would use my own money. I worked at a grocery store in high school, and I would pay the subscription to listen to the prayer room. But like one of the things that really hooked me was I found this tape of Paul and Mike, and they were talking about Paul's I See Stadiums visions is what it was, which opens up, I guess it's all at Arrowhead Stadium, the way he describes it in Kansas City. And there's reporters all lined up, and they're all saying that there's no news but good news today to report. And they start laying out this huge picture of what's going on, that the sick are being healed and the dead are being raised. And it's being led by this group of nameless, faceless people who are coming, and they're I can't remember the exact details, but they're ministering in shifts. And it was something like they were going 3 days or 72 hours, something like that, without food and water. And then they would come in, another team of nameless, faceless people would replace them. And I'm listening to this. I just started driving at the time and had only had a tape player. This was probably like 2004 or 5, something like that. And, listened to that whole tape that day. I remember sitting in my driveway and I was crying as I was listening to it, because in our previous conversation, we were talking about, it's not just like one day somebody walks up to you and asks you to join a cult and you say yes. It's like the stuff that had been like implanted in my heart and the way that I'm wired had set me up for that moment to say yes. It wasn't like there was some soft cells before the hard cell. And that was one of those moments that I was just like, man, this is what I want to do as a young 14-year-old worship leader. I was like, man, I want to have this kind of impact, because the only other like grandiose thing that I could compare to was like being a Chris Tomlin or something like that. And doing music festivals doesn't sound half as cool as like seeing dead people come to life and people being killed and, national media reporting it. And part of it, they were like, the sporting events have all been canceled because stadiums across America are filled. And I'm like, I want to be a part of that. And that started a deep, dark hole. That's what that started.
I can imagine. I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, so I would actually be sad. I would rather watch the Chiefs game than all of this. And I've been a Chiefs fan since before it was cool to be a Chiefs fan. I'll say
it wasn't that you were hoping for the revival after they won the Super Bowl. That's one of the prophetic promises.
I certainly was not.
That's one of the jokes we have, is the anxiety that happens every time the Chiefs go to the Super Bowl and they win. All of us in the post IHOP community, we have this anxiety of like, oh no, is it all true? Like, are we going to find out that all this was true and revival's actually going to happen? We all have slight panics.
Yeah, they set these things up in such a way that they're recurring fears. So in the Branham cult, it was from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You had the communist scare. You had all of the things that just wreaked havoc on people's minds in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We lived in the 2000s, 2024s. They're still teaching this. And so, and there were certain key quote unquote prophecies that we would look for. And one of them was that a female would become president. Well, you have a 50-50 chance, right? So anytime there's a woman who is running for president, all the preachers are going on. And right now, Kamala Harris is the big thing. She's going to fulfill.
Obama was the Antichrist when I was at IHOP. So that's what was going to happen.
Yeah. It's just so they wreak havoc with your mind. And they like to, we were talking earlier, they like to take things that can toy with your mind and set it up in such a way where they put you in an elitist category. You mentioned looking forward to the people who are going to be dying, because it creates this mentality where you just want to see it. They've painted this picture of this fantastic war scene and you want to see it. When Branhamism, they were called cannon fodder. And some of the cannon fodder, which that phrase means in war, these are the people that we don't care if they're going to die or not. They're the cannon fodder. some of those cannon fodder people would be Christians. And you look back and you think, what in the world? Even if that were true, if that were to be the case, why would you preach about it? This is something that should sadden you. It shouldn't bring you to a state of happiness.
Yeah, and that was the first night that I went to IHOP. My parents drove me to Kansas City. I was 17 years old. I graduated high school a year early to come and go to the ministry school. And we walk in that first night in the prayer room, and they're having their weekend service there. And Mike's preaching from Isaiah, talking about who is this coming up from Edom with garments stained red. And then he's talking about Revelation and blood up to the horse's bridle. And he's talking about Jesus slaying the kings of the earth. And I think that should have been my first sign that something was off. And even my parents sit there and listen to it, and they're like, "This is weird," but they really liked the music too, so they were okay. Right after Mike finished preaching, there was this song, and I look back at it, and it's weird because I have good memories with this song, but I also realize I'm like, man, that's part of the reason why I stayed is this song. But there was this song called "Finally Found Where I Belong," is what it was called. And the chorus was, "I finally found where I belong. I finally found where I belong is to be with you." And it's like you get a bunch of kids singing that in a prayer room, and there's messaging all around this, that this is where God wants you to be, and you can't leave or you're going to fall away. Like it was, we were ripe for the picking there to go into that. And then one of the things I'd mentioned to you earlier was with the eschatology, it was just so comical. We would always have these Q&As, they called them E12s at one point. There was like some kind of end time groups is what they were. And we even did these with the kids that would come for our summer awakening teen camps. So these are like 10 to 18 year olds that we would come in, and us being, 20 something year olds would come here and indoctrinate these kids about Mike's eschatology. And I was laughing because one of the most common questions that all the guys like to ask was, do we get to kill people too? And we didn't see any harm in it. Like, we see Jesus killing people, so we're like, why can't we kill people too? And it's so funny because we're so quick to point the finger at like other extremists and other religions and stuff. And then here we are, smiley white guy, going, do I get to kill people too? And for some reason, it's not as bad. I don't get it, but here we are.
Well, and some of the redneck churches down south, I can picture names of people who'd be like, "Yeah, give me the gun." It's just, it's scary. It's I'm laughing at the absurdity. It's a horrific thing, but it's scary what they teach you. They indoctrinate you in such a way that they can control you to the point where you would gladly do these things. And that's,
yes.
You look at Islam, and people paint all of Islam with the same brush, but there are Islam and there are Islamic extremists. And what you're essentially doing is you're creating Christian extremists when you do this.
Yeah.
Whether they've acted out or not, it's, beyond the point. But you mentioned Isaiah, and one of the things that really shocked me once I became aware of what was going on in these churches, the Christian identity, British Israelism framework, what it did was it created this thing where you could take a single passage out of the Old Testament, and then you could marry it with a passage from the New Testament, both of them ripped out of context, and then they could point it to something that's happening today. And usually these guys, these cult leaders, they will talk about the Old Testament prophet said such and such, and they will paint this story in your mind where you can relate every single thing that he is saying, doing, living, the way he lives directly to that prophet. So you're thinking that prophet is it the same? Is it the same? Then they do the same thing with the apostles, and the apostles are pointed to Jesus, but then they twist it such that the thing that's supposed to be pointed to Jesus is pointing towards them, their ministry, their whatever their movement is doing. And once I realized what this was, it's just so wrong. It's not even, there's the phrase extra biblical or anti-biblical. It's not even that. It's like they've weaponized phrases of the Bible to program heads to make them willing to, like you said, willing to kill people. That is scary.
No, it really is. and you buy it hook, line, and sinker. It's crazy because like we became apologists for the movement too, in the sense that like all these crazy things, like with Jesus killing people, like they would look at Philippians and say, well, every knee's going to bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and those who don't, or they're going to get the chopping block kind of thing. And it's like, well, it said every knee would bow and every tongue confess, but somehow there's resistors, or like, and those were categories that they would create, resistors and reprobate and like all these different things. And it was always just kind of creating some kind of new boogeyman is what it was. And so like the great falling away was, you know, one of the big things that were hung over our head. And Mike would talk about all the time. He would say, you know, I see people come in here all the time, come in for 6 months or, you know, a couple of years to do the school, and then they go and they fizzle out. He never would say that they're not Christians anymore, or he would never say anything like that. He would just use metaphors like that. They just go and fizzle out, or like, you know, they lost their purpose or whatever it might be. They're not a part of God's plan anymore. And he would, you know, exalt these people who's like the people that do it decades. He's like, some people last 10 years and burn out and they don't make it, you know? And he's like, but God's looking for those who are in it for their whole life. And you have that stuff like touted in front of you. And that's what keeps you in it day after day. And I had many moments where, you know, I thought that I was going to get out, having conversations with people. I was sharing one with you earlier where I had a worship team coach who pulled me aside. He caught wind that I was planning on leaving after my first year of school. And he says, Brantley, like, what are you doing? Like, what's your plan? He said, you're going to go home? Like, what's your plan? What are you going to do when you go back home? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, go help out my youth pastor at my church. Like, that was the best idea that I had as an 18-year-old. And he tells me, you know, I wish I could tell a lot of these people to go home and quit doing this because they're wasting their time, kind of thing. Like, they're, you know, they don't need to be doing this. And he's like, but he's like, you're going to be doing this for the rest of your life. And hearing a worship leader that I looked up to and idolized say that just meant so much to me, and kept me in it. And there was so many moments like that where I had moments where I was trying to pull away and there would be some kind of exhortation again. And it never was. I think sometimes people, they think about a cult and they think of, you know, men dressed in black and white vans pulling you back to the place. And IHOP wasn't like that. It wasn't that. It was your friend telling you, your roommate telling you, hey, don't give up, don't quit. And I don't think any of them were being nefarious. It was just the mind control that was happening to the masses. Like, they brainwashed us all and we were keeping each other in the fire is what was happening. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so hard to look at it and call it damaging. And, you know, with Mike's allegations coming forward of all this sexual abuse of minors and other women and things. And I think that helped people be able to go, okay, it's a cult because there's sex involved, kind of thing. Yeah. Which was good for people to be able to do that, to be able to take that step. Like, I guess that's a positive that's came from that. But, I've had to, you know, you talked about Stephen Hassan earlier, and one of my favorite things is his BITE model that he does, the behavior control and information control and thought control and was it emotional control? Yeah. And like being able to like filter all my experiences through that now I can give it a name. And that's like so much of the work of like healing is being able to name stuff and articulate stuff and hear people say stuff and go, oh, I experienced that too, you know?
Yeah, I remember when I read Dr. Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control the first time. I was out of the cult when I read it, and I thought, man, this is so far out there. It's not even close to what we escaped. And I've read it multiple times now, and at this point, I've analyzed a lot of what we. You're glitched. Your video still there?
I think so. Is it working now?
Yeah, it's working now. Cool. Yeah, I'll never forget when I read Dr. Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, the first time. I thought, man, this is so far out there. This is not even close to what we came out of. And I was out of the cult at that time. And it wasn't until, I've read it multiple times now, but it wasn't until I understood the concepts of what he was trying to say. It isn't that all cults are alike, but they have a very similar framework. And they like to tout phrases like the great falling away, for example. There's going to be a great falling away. Well, this is a good way to control the people, because when you see somebody leave, oh, well, they're part of the falling away. They're of the bad guys. And it's a good way to turn, Christians against their brothers too, because sometimes a Christian person decides to leave a church, but in these cults, they're part of the great falling away. The phrase that Branhamism uses, they went out from us because they were not of us. And so, it's so wrong when you apply that to another Christian person. And the thing that the media has done, you mentioned, it wasn't obvious until the sexual connections. The media has done a disservice, I think, to the cults, because they always show only the extremes.
Yes.
There's a sexual crime committed, so this is an extreme, this is an example of a cult, or mass suicide, whatever it is. But there is a slow progression that builds up to that climactic moment. And another thing is a lot of times the media will paint the picture of people who join a cult as being unintelligent. And, that there may be some people who are in a cult, but by and large, the people who are intellectual are sometimes more susceptible to joining a cult because they've worked with their minds all week long. They come into church on Sunday and they really just want to rest and shut off the outside world. And so unfortunately, they disable their critical thinking. And so the pastors will start preaching, and they will, in these cult groups, they'll bring it down to an elementary level, and they'll put out simple, just crazy, stupid things. Like in Branhamism, there was the 5s, the 7s, and the 3s, and if you could, and sometimes shapes too. If it was a pyramid, it was obviously spiritual. And so they would break it down to these elementary level. When you shut off your critical thinking, you're looking for these puzzle pieces that build into these broader pictures that they're painting. And, oh, well, that's a 7. I can see 7 in that category. Branham said he had 5 angels, and 5 spelled GRACE. And everybody's, oh,
of course,
my gosh. It's like, come on, man.
I just want to know what kind of trip Bob Jones was on whenever IHOP was given to him. Like, I want to know if he was sitting in an IHOP at like 2 a.m. and just looked at it and started coming up with his acronym. I don't know how.
Well, that's part of Branhamism 101 too. Branham often talked about how the only proper way to eat a pancake was to baptize it in syrup. So maybe, I don't know.
I can get behind that.
Yeah. I often say that's the only thing that Branham got right.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Like I had somebody tell me, I guess it was a couple months back, really smart person who's like they do strategy for companies and stuff. And she was stepping back and looking at what Mike had done with IHOP. And I hate to say it, I might be giving him too much credit, but I think the guy's a genius, like not a good genius, but the guy's like brilliant, or just very lucky, or trained very well. But he did a whole category creation thing. Like he invented intercessory missionary. Like what in the world is that? That he made a whole new title of, you come here, you sit in this prayer room, and you get people to give you money to stay here. The flip side of that is not many people gave us money to stay there, that we were all poor and impoverished or whatever. But he came up with all these different things. He came up with the worship model. You're talking about, turning your brain off and stuff. There was so much of what they called harp and bowl, where we would sing, spontaneously in the scriptures. And we had different kinds of sets where we would pray for prayer topics, but then sometimes we would just pray the Bible, which was just singing IHOP's theology. And most of it was just like slow and moody and lots of pads and reverb on guitars and ambient, and it would lull you to sleep. It would make you put your guard down. But there was so many of these pieces put in place that just made it I hate to say this, but it made it a brainwashing factory is what it did. And it got everybody, on the same page and singing the same stuff. And it got to the point to where I've just been realizing this recently, that allowed them to define so many things for me. And I guess that's the information thought control kind of stuff of, that I let them define who Jesus was, and it had to line up with their definition, even if I saw something different in Scripture or whatever. One of the big ones was justice, like their idea of justice. Like we would sing all the time a chorus that if it's not Jesus, it's not justice. We want Jesus. We want justice. And what that meant to them was if we're not preaching the gospel, if we're not, telling them our message, then it's not justice. You can go feed people, you can go clothe people, but if you're not bringing Jesus explicitly into it, it's the work of the Antichrist. And so, like they had a whole theology about a false justice movement in the Antichrist, and it's just amazing, like the power that we gave to these people in our lives. Like now that the blinders are off, I'm just like, how in the world? But it was a slow process. It was, it started when I was a kid and climaxed there. And the detangling was, it took just as long. It's taking just as long.
Yeah, you're a musician and I'm a musician. And I remember after I left this and I got to thinking back of the music, we had some of it was good. I'm not going to say all the music was bad, but there were certain songs that were obviously cult songs, and they were obviously with the intent to indoctrinate you. Some of them were about Branham and being the prophet, and we had songs like, not to the level that you had, but we had songs about we're the Christian army, we're going to war, this kind of thing, which was kind of common back, you go back into the early days of Pentecostalism. If you look at the timeline of the world wars and then look at some of that music that happened during this.
I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir.
Exactly. And though, that's lighthearted to some extent. Now, some of the verses, I go back and forth as to whether that's healthy or not. But after I left, I had trouble even listening to Christian music because I realized how the chanting works. It could indoctrinate you, and you could not even know that you're believing something false just because you're chanting this music over and over. Oh. And I'm convinced if I had never been in this cult and I had chosen my own pathway instead of having a lot of it chosen for me, I probably would have become a psychologist. And I study the psychology of it to no end. And I got into the study of the music. And, like I said, people who come into these things, they're tired. They want to shut off the world and relax. Mm-hmm. And just, here's a safe place. It's a church. It's a safe place.
And it's painted that way, too.
Yeah, it's painted that way. And so they, it's hypercharged now. But back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you'd come into this holy music in this holy sanctuary. The Branham type churches, you couldn't talk if you went into the sanctuary. The ushers would come in and they would take you out. They'd boot you out of the building if you spoke. And so you're coming in and you sit down and there's this soft organ playing and your heart rate slows down to that level because you're relaxed. Then the preacher starts preaching and he's also starting off really slow and he gives you this welcoming story that you can relate to and then speeds up throughout the course of the sermon until he's just yelling at you. And so you have entered this state where it's almost like the abused child scenario. You're isolating yourself mentally because you're being abused, you're being emotionally abused. And it's matching your heart rate. So he's brought you into the state of hypnosis where you've shut off everything and now he can have his way with your mind. You
set me up for an alley-oop there. Because it sounds like if you remove the Branham stuff from it, it sounds just like the prayer room. That's what it sounds like. From the ushers to everything. And so there was no talking in the prayer room. I can't think of anything more cruel than putting 400 to 500 people in a room, which is sometimes maybe 200-300, something like that. I don't want to exaggerate, but on like our big fasting days and things like that, when it was like all staff prayer meetings, you get all these people jam packed in a room and then tell them they can't talk to each other. Like we're all sitting there, exciting music, this and that. And if you went off into a side room and tried to have a personal conversation, you'd get ran out. And if you went outside the prayer room, you'd get in trouble because you're supposed to be in there keeping your commitment of your sacred trust of 24 hours a week. And it's crazy how that happens. And you're talking about the songs. we had a worship leader who wrote one song, Misty, who's one of the main worship leaders there, about the prophetic history. And I didn't realize it till I was like probably 2-3 years in IHOP that's what it was about. Because it's funny because I had no biblical foundation before IHOP, and they gave me just enough biblical foundation to like believe them hook, line, and sinker. Like they were the first people that told me that and articulated Jesus is fully God and fully man. And I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, oh my gosh, like they're teaching me Christology, and I learned what Christology was and like all these things. So I was like, why can't I trust them? And then whenever we're having like our anniversaries and stuff like that, she would break out this song of, I've heard the story told of the prophet who prophesied of the rain that would come in the middle of the drought that would be a sign of the rains to come. And then the chorus was, I'm still waiting for the rain, waiting for the rain. And so in an act of rebellion earlier this year, I posted about that song on social media and recorded a cover of CCR, Have You Ever Seen the Rain?
That's good. Yeah, we had similar. We had the song, and they stick with you, right? Even still today, yeah. I'll be out working on my car, and one of these things will pop in my head, and I'm humming, and I throw the wrench on the ground. I'm like, get that out of my head, man.
Yes, and some of them are good, and that's the problem. Like some of them are good melodies and like good jams. And it's just like, ugh. Yeah,
and we weren't allowed to. I did not know who CCR was until a few years ago. We weren't allowed to listen to it because in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the era we were stuck in, rock and roll was of the devil, and so I had never heard it. And I'll never forget. I was listening to my new music, and suddenly Midnight Special came onto the radio, and I'm like, wait a minute, that is the tune to the song that I sang growing up constantly. I still had it stuck in my head. We were singing, let the Holy Ghost message shine your ever loving light on you, and some guy had just completely robbed whoever's the band. I can't think of the band name, but
I think my family sang that song, John. I think they did.
Really?
Like, I don't think I actually know Midnight Special. I think I know the song you're singing. I think that's my point of reference.
Wow. So you got to go hear Midnight Special. It's actually a good song, but yeah, they use these techniques, and I'm convinced that people like, in today's world, the cults, I'm convinced that there was a strategy behind it because they're using the same exact strategies of the old years, but they've removed what no longer works, and they're attaching new things. Like one of the things is they love to do anything that can just completely rob you of your time. If they can hijack your time, they can hijack your mind, and especially if they can keep all your time focused on the cult, then you're constantly and continually brainwashing yourself. In the Branham cults, we did this because we were supposed to listen to these cassette tape recordings of Branham, but in today's world, it's so much more powerful. There's MP3s, there's the videos, now many of the cults have YouTube channels, and people are just pouring themselves into it.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
Yeah, it's interesting. Mike had one of his other teaching series. So he had his sevens. He had his 7 signs of a cult and 7 longings of the heart, and he had, all that stuff. But he talked about power of a focused life is what he called it. And he would talk about breaking your day up into 15-minute increments and talk about redeeming the time and how we'd all stand before Jesus and be accountable for every second of how we spend our time in our lives. And I remember that it's funny like how our body tells us things, like tells us that we're not safe, and we don't know how to listen to it sometimes. And sometimes we or at least I did. I ended up calling it, spiritual encounters or something. I had a dream one time where it was like this military boarding school type thing, and very in the spirit of Joel's Army, I guess is how I took it at the time. As soon as I woke up the next morning, I was like, oh my gosh, I was in Joel's Army. And we're looking at this whiteboard, me and my friends, I guess whoever in the Army with me, and this whiteboard, it's got the whole week mapped out, and I'm assuming it was the 15-minute increments. I just remember seeing these blocks under each day of the week and stuff, and seeing that everything was filled in, that there was no free time. And I remember looking at the board, and of all things to ask and to ponder and wonder, I look at the board and I go, I don't know when I'm going to have time to brush my teeth. And I remember that like blowing me away. But that is like, I'm doing this thing. I'm signing up. I'm signing up again. We're in, Joel's Army in training, and, we're getting equipped here. And Jesus is coming back. We're not going to fall away. Like all of it, just a constant tumbling there.
Yeah, I wasn't certain that everybody in our church wore deodorant, but it's a little bit worse if they didn't brush their teeth.
It's so insane. I mean, as a student, I was so I had it's about 3 hours a day that we would take a class, and it would be one class would last 3 hours. We'd take one class at a time, and then we also had to do prayer room hours, which were 24 hours a week, which usually ended up, you could do those almost however you wanted, but you had to do 12 2-hour prayer meetings a week is what it was. And so most people would either do, 4 days of 6 hours in the prayer room or 6 days of 4 hours in the prayer room. And I worked for the internship at the time as well, as that's how I kept a roof over my head. So I was kind of like an RA for the internship. I lived with the interns and made sure they didn't do crazy stuff. And most of the time I was the instigator of the crazy stuff, but we won't get into that. Brought a little levity to the cult, I guess. But, so I had requirements there as far as like my job to keep a roof over my house, over my head. So I had a bedroom there, and then they gave us 3 meals a week out of the cafeteria is what they would let the staff do. So I knew I was at least going to eat 3 times a week. And then outside of that, I worked at a church on Sunday mornings. It was the only time I got outside the bubble. So it's a weird dynamic at IHOP. Like I look like, not to be arrogant, but I'm like, I'm a good musician. I'm a good worship leader. Like I know that I'm good at what I do. But good musicians and worship leaders and stuff are a dime a dozen at IHOP. Like everybody is a great singer. Everybody's a great musician, worship leader. And so I took this job on Sunday mornings at a local Methodist church, and I'd get paid $100 a week to go lead worship for them. And then I could bring a team of like 5 or 6 people, and they would pay them $50 a piece. So I had this little conglomerate of IHOppers who would pile in a van with me, and we would drive to Shawnee, about 45 minutes away, and go lead worship at this church. And that was the only money that I made. And so I had that, $400 a month, and I got the roof and the 3 meals, and somehow I lived off that. Like nowadays, I don't know how that would have, kept me afloat now that I'm an adult with kids and a family and pay real rent, I'm like, I don't know how I survived. But they did, they filled our schedule completely. With requirements. Every Friday and Saturday night, we had required services we were supposed to be at. So we never got the traditional weekend experiences. And then sometimes you'd have to go, depending on the season of what was going on. Sometimes you had to be there at Sunday morning service too. And so they did a good job of keeping us busy all the time.
Yeah, I can't even imagine putting myself through that. It sounds like, so you're in the Joel's Army. It almost sounds like you're in a platoon, right? The way that they, the way that they structure this. I'll never forget. Like I said, I had examined Mike Bickle and IHOP from a distance, just noticing odd similarities. But it wasn't until I saw the Southern Poverty Law Center's big write-up on, what's his name, Todd Bentley. Whenever it really struck me, Joel's Army, Manifested Sons of God. That's Branhamism 101. And it even predates Branham to some extent because it's Christian identity theology. And they're basically, they were trying to form the notion that we were forming the final end of days warriors for the end of days battle between the forces of good and evil. And you're going to be part of it because you're of the special group.
Is that where the white supremacy stuff came into the Branham stuff? Was that linked to the Christian identity?
It's this big weird conglomeration of everything. So Branham's mentor was the second in command of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan, and later the Imperial Wizard. So he got some of his ideas from that, although a lot of it has been scrubbed. You won't find many direct themes, but what you will find is there was this growing notion that from British Israelism, which is the weird anti-scientific, anti-correct theology that the people of the American Isles and the British of the Americas and the British Isles were the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Well, there became this sudden notion that if you take some of the passages that were written to Israel in the Old Testament, they apply, but they only apply in part. We have to have a new prophet to tell us how they apply to us today. And so they would take weird things like...
So you need another cult.
Yeah, you basically need another cult. So Branham took the prophecy of Nahum and he said, now Nahum, who, oh, by the way, is writing about ancient Assyrians, and Nineveh, and it even says a prophecy to Nineveh, I think, at the top of the scroll. Branham says he is describing Outer Drive in Chicago. And what they were doing, I studied all kinds of things because I'm trying to figure out how and why people believe this nonsense. There was a sudden, unexplainable tidal wave that hit Lake Michigan, and people died because all of a sudden, out of the blue, there's this sudden tidal wave surging for no reason. They can't figure it out. Now they have figured it out. It is it's a natural occurrence. But back then, nobody knew what this was, and they'd never heard of this. So the people who were trying to build religion off of fear was claiming that this was God telling us the end of the world is coming, and Nahum is writing about us right here in the prophecy. So you had this weird mixture of people thinking that they're Israel, and then you had all of the wars and the fears of another third world war. So they were creating armies, and then mix all of this with the British Israel theology, because it's the notion that the Anglo-Saxon race were the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, people got to thinking, oh, well, if they're not Anglo-Saxon, they must be the bad guys. So then it turned into a racist theme, and that just spread like wildfire.
It's crazy because, like, once you see some of this stuff, you see it everywhere, and it's like hard to unsee. And that's like one of the scariest things, like looking at right now and like learning some of these history things. I don't know if you're familiar with, I hope I say her name right, but Kristen Dumais, who did the Jesus and John Wayne book. I don't know if you're familiar with her at all.
I've heard of it, yeah.
She done a whole lot, and she kind of dives into not as much the white supremacy side of Christianity. I mean, there's some of that at play, but she dives into some of the Red Scare stuff. And like, I had no idea that Billy Graham was up there saying that, these are the devil's attacking America kind of thing. We're God's people and the communists are coming for us, and it's a spiritual attack and this and that. And I'm like Billy Graham is like a hero. Like, I've never heard anybody say anything bad about Billy Graham. And I'm like, like all these positive things. And I'm like, I hear him saying this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like these guys, like there's some kind of connection. There's something, like they're not coming up with this on their own. But then you start to see like modern day examples of it, and you're just like, oh gosh.
Oh, yeah.
Makes you scared. That's what it does.
Exactly. And that's why Christian poverty or Southern poverty law published this. They monitor the racist groups and extremist groups, right? Well, the Joel's Army, it developed because of Christian identity. And Christian identity was, there were different aspects of it, but one of them was they took this book called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which told of this Jewish communist plot against the world. There's going to be global domination by the Jews, and they've infiltrated the government, the school systems. They're now coming into media and television. And anyway,
sounds like Seven Mountain Utopias.
Exactly. I've been going through this. Every single thing that the NAR has today, I can find it in Christian identity, which is really, really scary. But Billy Graham was he was a big part of this. He was pushing a lot of the same agendas, and he even, I can't remember what year that was, but he had to go back and repent because of some of the anti-Semitic things that he said because of the Christian identity themes that were dominating.
Yeah, it's crazy, just like because although a lot of these harmful things were experienced at IHOP that I experienced, like you see a lot of them in broader Christianity, and not to make like judgment statements about things and people's beliefs and what they want to believe. But in my experience, growing up with ideas like total depravity and being told that, my goodness is nothing apart from God and that my righteousness is filthy rags and all these things, being told that over and over does something to your psyche to where you begin to think that you're a worthless piece of junk, and that there is no good in you. And I remember that's whenever the wheels started falling off for me was in 2020. I saw, hopefully, if people agree with this, they can. If they don't, whatever. But for me, I started seeing, during the pandemic and all, we had the BLM riot protest stuff, depending on what side of the aisle you call it, different things. And I remember it was that day whenever, if I can say his name, I hate even saying his name. That's how much like division is around this stuff. But I remember when Trump took that Bible and walked up the road to do that photo op in front of that church, and they ended up, I can't remember if it's National Guard or local police or Capitol Police, whatever it was going and moving these people out of the way so Trump could walk up to do a photo op with this Bible and this thing. And I mean, they're just brutalizing these people, like just so he could take a picture. And what I see is Black people and gay people helping each other up. And I'm like, okay, like the church has told me that these are bad people and that they can have no good, like apart from God. And then I see, one of the biggest demonized segments of society, of the LGBT community, I see them helping all these people. And I'm like, how can I look at that and call it bad? It's crazy how pervasive, the supremacy kind of idea is and how much it's ingrained, and I don't think it's talked about enough. And IHOP had some stuff like somebody had a dream about Mike Bickle and an afro, and they were talking about people coming out of hip hop into IHOP, and they like end up launching this whole African American Forerunner Alliance ministry and started doing conferences for Black people. And it was such a weird kind of thing, but you could talk to any person of color who was at IHOP and they were pushed to the sides. They were only given a voice whenever it helped the greater good and they could control it. If anybody started pushing back on anything, they were put behind a soundboard or put in a back closet somewhere, doing broadcast audio or somewhere where they can't make a racket. And it's just the roots of evil that happen in these places. I'm like, how dare y'all say that we have no good? And this is your fruit,
It's so wrong. They dehumanize people. And the fact that you mention the word homosexual means that thanks to you, I'm going to have my inbox filled up, my comment feeds filled up with people. Even the mention of the word, people are so charged, politically charged against it. And it's there are scriptures that talk about homosexuality. It is there, it's black and white, and it's listed as a sin. There are other things that are listed as sin, such as drunkenness. And we talked about drinking earlier, right? Well, back in the 50s and 60s, before the homosexual agenda was politicized, it was the prohibition agenda. And if you went back into that era, if you were to mention alcohol like we did casually, they would have received not, emails, but they would have received people with ball bats coming up to get them. It is a political weaponization of religion. And
it's the pro-life movement now. I mean, that was a big part of IHOP. I never had any other option growing up. I didn't even know. I just knew we voted for pro-life candidates. I remember at my home church growing up having pamphlets, and I'm pretty sure this is against tax code and stuff like that, but they would have pamphlets of all the pro-life people so that you could take it to the poll and know who to vote for. Not on anything else, just that they didn't believe in an abortion. That was the sole determining factor. They could be the biggest crook in the world, but as long as they were pro-life, that's what we did. And I mean, they would have us go out and do, I don't know if you ever saw the Bound for Life tape things where we put red life tape over our mouths. And they did a thing in DC for a while where they set up a house of prayer there with Lou Engle and would protest on the Supreme Court steps. And you start to hear some of these people put together, and there's lots of people who've talked about it, putting these pieces together of the politicalization, I can't even talk right, of all of this, with like the Pat Robertsons and the Falwells and all these characters who like come together, and you realize you're like, oh my gosh, these guys are pulling all our strings and they're like trying to control all this. And then you're like, is America a cult? I don't know. But
and to people like you and I who are empaths, we really want to help people genuinely. You and I had a deep conversation about this. It's one of the things that really bothers me because, I can't dehumanize a person. Even when I was in the cult, I couldn't do this. And the fact I had a person who admitted recently on a podcast that years ago he had struggled with homosexuality. Yeah. And I actually had people that were blasting me because I didn't attack him for his past sin of homosexuality. I'm like, I'm not like this. Number one, I don't want to do it, but it's not right. And I'm not in a religion where I'm politicized, where I have to hate people. And I will never, ever be in a religion like this. The abortion issue, I've watched women on the news who are crying because they're in a state where their life is at risk. They might die because of the baby that's in them. And I've watched some of these Christian ministers who say things like, well, if we allow this, then we're opening the door to widespread abortion. So they're dehumanizing the person who actually might die. And I can't be like this. It's not me.
It's crazy how we're programmed to look at people that way and to feel a personal responsibility for their decisions. And that's been one of the hardest things to be able to pinpoint, like where that comes from for me. Is, it's whether they're going to burn in hell forever and that fear, and you kind of have that personal thing. I remember, growing up and in the churches I did, we all had a prayer list and the souls we prayed for and the souls we wanted to see saved. And we would grieve and grieve and grieve. It's not that I don't, have space for people to believe those things, but the fact that it would derail my life based on choices that somebody else was making was just so interesting. And I've seen so many lives damaged from that kind of stuff. I have, many friends, because one of the things IHOP engaged in pretty voraciously, but they probably deny is conversion therapy type stuff. And I've seen the harm that's had on friends. I've seen friends who were forced into heterosexual marriages and see those things fall apart later because that's, the people have their opinions. You can have your opinions on it, but I saw the harm that was left, because of that, because of what had happened. And, that's everything that I do, everything I've been doing. We've been setting up, support spaces and things like that for a while. And we've been hosting conversations on Friday nights. And that's been one of the biggest things is we've been telling people is like, you're going to hear diverse opinions. You're going to hear things that you might not agree with. And that's okay. Nobody's trying to change your mind. Nobody's trying to tell you that you're wrong. Like we're not trying to do any of that, but we're trying to listen to one another. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to listen to experiences, which is one of the reasons why I appreciate Wesley's theology of giving experience a little bit of credence. But you can't question somebody's experience and the harms that they experience. Their conclusions, you might not agree with their conclusions of why that harm exists, but we can all empathize and see it and understand it and call it harm. Like we can see that. And I just wish we had more of that in the world. And that's why I do stuff like this, is because I want people to see people as humans. That's huge.
It is huge. It's, the cults teach you a very black or white mentality. It's either right or it's wrong. It's either good or it's evil. There's no in between. And what it takes away is the element of growth to learn why it's right or it's wrong. And you're not really allowed the questions of finding out, well, do you agree if it's right or wrong? You're told you must believe it. And when people leave these cults, they're stuck with that mentality.
Yeah.
And the simple process, like I was born and raised in it, I never had a chance to even discover what was right or wrong. I was told this is what God is, and they painted this narcissistic God that honestly, if I had have been able to critically think, I would say, I don't even like this God. Why would I want to serve a narcissistic God? And it's not the God of the Bible, by no means, but the problem is it's black or white, and when people leave this, they've been manipulated to believe that they can't have that personal growth, and many of them are starting as if they're teenagers again, spiritually and sometimes mentally. So they have to go through that growth, and many times, I mean, one of the first things that happens to a teenager is, well, do I even believe in God? Why do I believe in God? My parents, they're Christian. Why am I Christian? Just because they're Christian. Many teenagers go through this. Well, people who deprogram from a cult and they deconstruct, they're deconstructing a false God that really doesn't even match the Bible, doesn't exist. And they're questioning that God, so they have nothing. And if you try to force upon them what it is that they're supposed to believe, you're no better than the cults. And that's the reason why I have such an open platform. I don't care who you are, what you believe, if you've been burned by a cult. I'm going to hear your voice if you're willing to share your story with others, and other people can learn from it. And who am I to say that, people who have taken one path now won't come into a Christian path later? I'm not the one that makes that decision. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's in the post-IHOP community. I mean, all of us came from a Christian background, and so there's still a lot of that language, and that's the primary way we still all communicate. But there's people all across the board of, they may be, their own version of Christian, whatever that means to them. They may have gone to like a more liturgical church now, or they may be agnostic, but some of them are still using the same language to describe their experiences. But I loved, one of my friends was on a podcast the other day, and somebody had come kind of aggressively for the deconstructing folks. I guess they're easy targets these days. And in her response to him, because he was trying to pigeonhole her into an answer, and she's like, I hear a lot of things said about these people. She's like, but what I hear them saying is Jesus would not treat people this way. She's like, that's what I hear them saying. I don't hear them say, hail Satan, worship the devil, I want to sin. Like, I hear them say, like, this is not what Jesus looks like. And we had talked about earlier in our conversation, like that's one of the things that like give me so much peace is looking at all these threads throughout my life. Although 14-year-old Brantley would probably look at 33-year-old Brantley now and call him a heretic and fear for his eternal salvation. But there's parts of 14-year-old Brantley that's still me, that still exists. And that's one of them, is like, I really believe and still frankly believe in the things that Jesus did and taught and said. But like, it's the least of these message. It's like, when do we hear that? Like, it's so much of it's supremacy, whether it's Christian supremacy with 10 commandments and forced free, Bibles and curriculums and things like that. Like, I get, like, I've been there and I've supported those things at times, but we just need to let people be and grow, and people are good people. We just need to let them be good people, and good things will happen. Quit trying to control everything. And it's a tangent, John.
It is for me too. I mean, I'm a people person. I love all people, I would have Mike Bickle on this program if he'd do it.
I would pay to do that.
I wouldn't agree with everything he said by no means, but being in the upper echelons of the cult that I escaped, I sympathize with even the leadership, because some of them had backgrounds that led them down the path that they went. Granted, they are predators, many of them, maybe not sexually, but they're spiritual predators, many of them. But I know, and I was close friends with William Branham's son, maybe not as close as other people, but he was a good friend of mine. I cried real tears when he died. And that man is responsible. if you look at from a Christian standpoint, that man is responsible for several people who went completely away from real Christianity into this cult. And this was not what you would consider as a good person by Christian standards, but he was trapped into it also. He was the son of the man who's doing the same thing. I feel sorry for him.
Yeah. That's where it gets so messy. It gets so messy whenever it says the abused become abusers. It's like these like mid-tier executives, if you will, in these organizations. And it's like, at what point does the culpability change hands? And I don't think it's a question any of us can answer. But we become that because that's what we were taught. I mean, I did some things to people that I had to apologize for later on. I remember I had this one friend who, back to the drinking, found out that he was drinking. He was an IHOP U student, and as IHOP U, we have to sign these agreements, and we were trying to help this guy. And I don't even think he was abusing alcohol, but I didn't even have the competency to know what alcohol abuse was. I thought if you took a sip of alcohol, it was alcohol abuse, you know? And this guy had like a 6-pack in his fridge is like what it was. So like, I mean, obviously if he drank all that at one time, he'd probably have a good time, but like that's not what he was doing every day. And it was probably very similar. I can't remember if that was when we were talking here in this recording or not, but whenever you're talking about sipping alcohol and it helping your head, like, I mean, it could have very well been something like that for this kid. But the administrators found out, and somehow me and my roommates got pegged as the people to rehabilitate this guy. And I remember he kept going back to alcohol. And I remember I was standing outside the music academy in the parking lot talking to this guy, and I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't figure out. I'd gone to his house and poured out the beer in his front lawn with him watching. He moved in with us at our house, and he still couldn't stay away from alcohol. So I'm standing out there, and I'm like, man, dude, like, I don't know what else to do. I guess according to the Bible, I'm supposed to hand you over to Satan. Like that was, except I was dead serious. I wasn't just my jovial self. I was dead serious. Like, we're going to have to hand you over to Satan because we don't know what to do with you. And it's just, it's crazy how you end up becoming a part of that system. You do. Yeah. You end up abusing people yourself, and it's something we all have to reckon with.
Yeah. It's hard. And I can't imagine being a minister. And that's usually the last resort. When they give up on you, they will do this. They'll turn you over to Satan. We've been in real churches now where the minister, some of the people, man, they can be pains, but he tries to bear through it. And, you know, how many times are you supposed to forgive them? 70 times 7. I don't know that he's made it that far yet, but, you know, who knows? But so if you could say something to encourage people who have been in the IHOP or similar cults and have escaped, what would you say to encourage them?
I think just stay the course. Like, listen to other people's experiences, share your experiences with people who have done similar things. There's tons of support communities and things out there to where you can find online. If it wasn't for, thank God for the pandemic that taught us all how to be friends on the internet without actually meeting in person. Because that's opened up so many relationships for me. I don't have hardly any friends here in Virginia Beach, if I'm being honest, that I hang out with regularly. But I have so many friends I'm on the phone with all the time or in Facebook chats with. And find those people who've experienced similar things as you and asking the same questions as you, and be gracious with yourself. Be very kind to yourself. Like you said earlier, that, you know, it seems like the cults go after the intelligent people. Like it's not the run-of-the-mill folks that fall for it. Sometimes it's the sincere, the wholehearted, and whatever your belief about God is now, like if you still believe in God, I think God sees that and honors that still. I think that, you know, those reaches that are in your heart for good and kindness and love, that's still in your heart. And that's not, you know, it doesn't just go away because you realized it was all a cult. Like, you can still love and be kind and hold on to those things. But, don't do it alone, because it's miserable alone. I spent 2 years sick because I tried to do it alone, disabled. Find some friends and it'll be a whole lot easier.
That's very good advice. Well, I'm so glad that you came on to share your story with others, and I'm certain you'll be encouragement to other people. So thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you, John.
Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the healing revivals, read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.